So, Alex, I have known you a fair number of years, and I have never known you to be alarmist. Nonetheless, last week's email, well, one of last week's emails from the Mexico Political Economist was pretty alarmist. You talk about Sheinbaum's government creating a police state. Do say more.
It sounds like hyperbole because people often use these words to describe bad things, right, generically. I tried to use the term in the most literal sense possible, which is the creation of an intelligence government apparatus that is used to survey as many citizens as possible, regardless of whether they're criminals or not. So it's alarmist in the sense that it is alarming, but it's also a use of the word in its correct sense. The really controversial reforms, the ones that have just passed through the Mexican government. And what's annoying to me is that these intelligence reforms are just not controversial enough. People aren't talking about them.
Is it maybe that people are not talking about them because this has always happened in Mexico and Mexican history?
To an extent, but not like it is happening now. I think that's the great confusion at the moment. We've had this long debate for centuries, which is freedom versus security, which we all know is a false dichotomy. If you give up security for a bit of freedom, you'll get neither and deserve none. But what's important to me here is that there's a sort of naivete to the defenders of these laws, people who just instinctively defend the president. They firstly say, well, you're never happy because security is the biggest priority for this government. You've got to get the cartels. You've got to stop violence. This is the way to do it. And to an extent, there is a certain logic to that. I understand that throwing armed men at other armed men has simply just resulted in more violence. And intelligence is a very good way of bypassing the violence and just getting at the core of things, which is where these people are, where criminal money flows go, etc. Right? So I do understand the logic and I actually support that. But these laws specifically are just so, firstly, poorly done and are based entirely on the conceit that this is a good government and therefore it can do no wrong. The biggest example to me is the defenders of these reforms saying, what are you guys worried about? Don't worry. I mean, you still need warrant to tap people's phones. That's judicial oversight. But they've created this intelligence apparatus that is more akin to Amazon Prime. And wiretaps are so passé. Like, who gives a damn about a wiretap if the government has basically got all the power of Spotify, Amazon Prime, and all your banks put together with this algorithm that they're going to insert into it to be able to look at everyone's data all the time with no restrictions? And like, that's literally what the law says, right? Private and public databases are being concentrated into a national platform where the government has complete access to it, doesn't have to tell anyone what they're doing. It's literally like, you know, those stories about like how Walmart, like what back in the loyalty card days, so this is pre-algorithmic, could tell that a woman was pregnant before she knew she was pregnant just by what she was buying. Imagine the government having a billion times more data pieces than that and complete access to it with no transparency. And that's literally what they've built. Who is at all worried about wiretaps in that context?
I mean, that is terrifying.
And what's mostly terrifying to me is, let's assume this government is good. It doesn't matter. Organized crime in Mexico is so powerful that we know that it infiltrates the government all the time. There was a really recent report about the Sinaloa cartel using government webcams across like cities and its databases to stalk and murder an FBI agent working in Mexico. And what's interesting to me is this is such an old story in this country. Ultimately, we've seen this before. American intervention, spies, organized criminals, and the government overstepping the line only to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And I'm worried that we're going to see the same thing with Claudia Sheinbaum this time. And this isn't something recent, right? Like, I know, like, for example, the transparency versus intelligence services debate has been going on for a while. It was literally the plot for a James Bond film recently, and it's pretty much a conservative mouthpiece because it says, oh, these bureaucrats are always trying to oversee spies who are just doing their job. But really, when you look at history, it always backfires. Espionage always backfires without democratic accountability and when it's completely concentrated in the hands of people. And you don't even need tech to make this work. You can make this work with early 20th century espionage methods. And that is what we're going to talk about today. The history of Mexico's espionage system, this police state that was created under Porfirio Díaz, that led to the revolution and then failed spectacularly when the revolution started. We're going to be weaving this story of the Porfirio Díaz regime, which was around from 1876 until 1911, when the Mexican Revolution kicked him out of power. And we're going to talk about the espionage and police state that he created. But we're going to be coming back to the present all the time, because history really does rhyme when it comes to the police state that was in existence back then and the one that we're trying to create now, regardless of the algorithms, the AI, and all the computers in between. Actually, it's pretty much the same story being told all over again.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the history of Mexican espionage, particularly focused internally, Mexico hasn't really had extensive externally focused espionage. It's all been sort of keeping house focused. Has a long history in Mexican history, period, but particularly in the 20th century. So before we get to Porfirio Díaz, it's important to note that pretty much every 18 years, there's a massive reform of the Mexican intelligence apparatus. It happened under Fox. Then there's a version that's not even every 18 years, but it happened 6 years later with Felipe Calderón. The version of it happens again with Enrique Peña Nieto. The latter two already because of the war against drug dealers. But throughout the 20th century, it keeps happening. They change name and the rules change a little bit of what they can and cannot do. But for the most part, it's just elements of a police state. My absolute favorite, I have to say, is from the late 20s to the early 30s, something called, I'm not making this up, it's called the Confidential Department. And it has a range of, like, the 7 things that it was supposed to do. Like, some of them are clearly nefarious or with nefarious intentions. They can do things such as investigate anything and everything that the different branches of the executive or the Ministry of the Interior tell them to do. So that's pretty wide. They can apprehend anyone that these different dependencies tell them to do. But my favorite is number 7, which is they are, in general, to focus on all confidential services that they might be trusted with.
This is a hallmark of police state legislation because it's all incredibly legalistic all the time, right? Espionage apparatuses in dictatorial and democratic regimes tend to have wider or more restrained powers depending on how much democratic oversight there is on them. And the more vague the language is, the more potential for overreach. This is one of the biggest issues that I have with the Sheinbaum legislation currently. It sounds a lot like this confidential department language, which is just, in general, access to everything, sort of like always talking about things in the vaguest of terms so that when they land on you, they can say, well, we're allowed to do it because it's just an incredibly vague legislation. My favorite one in the current legislation here in Mexico at the moment is the fact that you're supposed to get ID'd for services and purchases generally. And that's what the legislation says, which means everything. That's like, if you read that as a lawyer, that literally just means if you go and buy a stick of gum at the shop, you need to get ID'd and your data for having bought that product needs to be put into a database. Obviously, no one's going to do this, which kind of opens you up to a legal process, right? This is kind of the issue with incredibly onerous demands from the government. It allows them to get all this information, and if it's really onerous that you just don't do it, it allows them to have an excuse to grab you in the night.
Another problem here is part of the reason we try to defend what the government is doing or the governments have done, because it's not always with the intention of doing terrible things to good people. I think the logic is, we don't know from which angle we're going to need to hit the criminals. So we need to have an open door, do the things that we need when we need to do them. And sure, that makes sense. The problem is these criminals are very good at what they do. So they tend to be one step ahead. And by virtue of creating this open door, it's an open door to anything. And who is not one step ahead? The average citizen who might be doing a podcast about how this is not a good idea.
That's exactly right. Ultimately, the most obvious thing when it comes to the current legislation saying that you've got to register your purchases is they say what we're trying to detect is whether you're making massive sort of like investments in housing or what sort of phone you're getting, because that's how like criminals communicate. But criminals are like way ahead of this. They're already threatening people to buy phones for them so that they're not tracked. They're already using intermediaries to buy houses and stuff. The only idiots who are doing things legally in the right way are people like you and me, Tavo, who aren't in organized crime.
Now, all that's well and good, and the reality is that we often tend to exaggerate just how bad things are, or by focusing on how bad they can be, right? And I think that's very applicable to the case of Porfirio Díaz that we want to focus on today, because in the imagination, the common imagination of Mexican people, Porfirio Díaz regime was particularly nefarious, right? He's the evil dictator, and yes, that has been partially constructed by the public education system that comes out from the revolution has to paint him as, the baddie of baddies. But some of that is built on some measure of fact, or at least institutions and actions that gave them some measure of fact, right? Porfirio Diaz did do things, and Porfirio Diaz and his team of people across the country did do things to create some measure of a police state. What's interesting here is it was quite a vast organization. It was there were two sort of components that responded directly to the president. That was the secret police and something that they called La Acordada. Now, La Acordada it dates back to colonial periods. It's a sort of moving court that was there to deal with criminals, particularly criminals like bandits on the roads in the 18th century. And the idea is that this court would move around to expedite the process of dealing with these criminals. What that ended up turning into was a court that didn't really follow the law and could just shoot people willy-nilly, which might have made some sense in a country that at one point was incredibly dangerous because of bandits, right? So the bandits would do terrible things and then they would pay off judges or just run away or have other bandits help them run away. So there's something that you need to do to control this. And that is, 18th century and 19th century history. But in the case of Porfirio Diaz, late 19th century and very early 20th century history, La Cordada and their foot soldiers, los rurales, the rurals, because they operated in a rural space, went from being or focusing on bringing safety to the roads, which they did do a bit of, to becoming sort of this Gestapo-like force for the federal government.
Like, it's kind of insane to me how alike this is to what we're seeing now, right? So people will hear this and say, yes, the lawless roads and stuff, the cartels going in and out of towns. But it's way more than that, because I think a lot about the newly created National Guard. We've covered what it is in the Mexico Political Economist, so we'll link that in the show notes. But just briefly, it's a body created by the previous administration under Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who creates this militarized gendarmerie, basically. And their main job is to look after roads, to stop migrant smuggling, they say, but it's also to stop migrants from getting to the United States, and also just to deal with highway crime. And what's crazy is a crucial part of the Claudia Sheinbaum intelligence reforms feeds directly into the National Guard and gives them enormous amounts of power. So this weird pipeline in Mexico from road security in rural areas to militarized responses to intelligence apparatus is incredibly clear.
I think there is a very good logic, or there could be a very good logic of why to do this, which is, you're protecting the roads. That's going to lead to economic stability, and economic stability leads to political stability. So everyone's happy. But what tends to happen when you create these bodies of armed individuals there to make sure the economy works, you can just skip the economy part and go direct to the stability. And by that I mean the political stability. Why don't you use all these armed individuals to then just neutralize people who could pose a political threat? It's a lot more expedient. Now, of course, ideally that's going to work a lot better if the economy is also functioning properly and so on. But that can easily become a second derivative focus. And that is very much what happened in the case of Porfirio Díaz. In the early days of the Porfiriato, the first, say, decade, Porfirio Díaz is actually very good. We need to remember that for the better part of the 19th century, Mexico had just been absolute chaos, invaded by the French, invaded by the British, civil war, you name it. And the country that he inherits in the late 19th century doesn't work one bit. There is banditry everywhere. It's absolute chaos. And so in those first 10 years, the work of the rurales is incredibly effective in bringing some measure of stability, of safety to the roads, which allows for economic growth and economic stability. So those first 10 years are pretty good. But it's what happens after those 10 years that starts becoming problematic. Because Porfirio Díaz had no interest in relinquishing political power. And there's only so much that you can do economically and socially if you're not really willing to change up the way in which things are done politically at the highest levels, which he had no interest in doing. So in the last 20 years of his government, the rurales and the intelligence and security apparatus of Porfirio Díaz's regime very rapidly shifts towards not focusing on road safety, not focusing on safety at large, but on maintaining the political power base and the political stability of those in power.
Now, this is more or less where we're at now, or rather, like the step before, right? Credit where credit's due. Claudia Sheinbaum specifically has been pretty effective in 6 months of government, from this switch between just throwing armed soldiers at cartels to this intelligence apparatus. I think, it's very clear that we've seen a lot of results on the basis of that switch, right? She claims that these reforms are giving her and her team the necessary tools to get the final job done. But really, what she's done so far is pretty good, right? Incredibly good isolation of financial transactions, information that she's already got access to. I think they're frustrated that they can't get more because they're playing fair versus the cartels who aren't playing fair. But that's more or less where we're at now, which is like the Porfirio Díaz in the early days actually getting stuff done and being pretty popular. So that's pretty good, right? But could you tell us a bit about that switch? Why does he go from guy who's getting stuff done, doing the people's will, doing things properly, to switching towards repressing one's own people with the same organizations that were used to protect them?
I think it's very simple. Porfirio Díaz comes in leading basically a revolt against those in power under a slogan of no re-election. But then after essentially 2 successive periods in power, he has no interest in giving up that power. So he starts using that apparatus that he's created to make sure that he can stay in power. So in 1879, there's rumors of a revolt that's going to happen in Veracruz. This is in the eastern part of the country, in the Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America, apparently these days.
If you're wrong,
exactly. And he starts using his henchmen, basically his armed henchmen, to go and neutralize individuals who could pose a threat to his government. Individuals that had an intention of taking the fort of San Juan de Ulúa, still in use at the time in Veracruz, and to take the city of Veracruz, which is a very, very important port and was even more important back then. And then slowly he started applying this logic everywhere. Well, if there are enemies in Veracruz, there must be enemies in Querétaro and Oaxaca and Coahuila. And he starts using all these men and all this power and all his networks to find these people and neutralize them. With time, he starts doing that with an aim towards finding them before they're even a problem.
Yes, predictive technology, always the government's best friend.
Exactly. The tricky thing here, and I think this is where the biggest problems could come from Sheinbaum's government, because Sheinbaum's government has not shown to be the military juntas of Uruguay, of Argentina. It has not shown to be the Gestapo or the Italian black shirts. This isn't a fascist regime seeking, to destroy liberty and freedom. But I think they're opening a Pandora's box that can really, really get out of hand. When I talk about, say, the military juntas in Uruguay or Argentina come in and they deploy the army to neutralize what were enemies of the state and people who were behaving rather poorly. But then their goal from the get-go is to stay in power and continue to neutralize baddies, or whoever they determined were the baddies. They were bad from the get-go, even if they were doing something that was partially justifiable. Sheinbaum is not doing that. The idea is we have failed at controlling the narco. The narco has basically taken over much of the country. There is an entire generation of people who have only lived in a country infested by war and chaos to a degree in certain parts of the country, and we want to stop this. Now, this is a very respectable goal, and intelligence is probably a way to do it. It's what we criticized about Calderón. He starts a war without really having any intelligence. That was a bad idea, and we're seeing the repercussions of that 20 years later. The problem is, it's very easy to think that you're going to be able to control this thing, and it's also very easy for it to completely get out of hand. In the case of Porfirio Díaz, they didn't have anywhere close to even like the idea of creating something as vast and as potentially powerful as what Sheinbaum is building. But a wonderful example of something that worked until it didn't comes from the spy master that was Bernardo Reyes. Bernardo Reyes is a powerful and very effective ally of Porfirio Díaz, almost until the very end of his government. He runs the state of Nuevo León and de facto runs also Coahuila and Tamaulipas. This is the northeast of the country and much of the border with the U.S. And we're finding a lot of evidence these days. There's a lovely article by a historian from the Universidad de Querétaro, Leonardo Ríos Vázquez, where he talks about the very effective work that Reyes did as a spy master. And what he did basically was he had a network of people in the U.S., like U.S. government officials, in Mexico. Some of them were criminals, some of them were the police, some of them were military, but he had people everywhere, all reporting to him on the doings and whereabouts of people that he believed to be potentially or openly subversive. And it worked well because for the longest time in Mexico, political turmoil came from people who you knew could be a problem. So we knew that there were political candidates that could be an issue. There were, the known dissidents, people who openly said, "I am against the government," so you just watch them. And then criminals who were making a lot of money from contraband and these kinds of things, and they could become a bit of a pain. So Reyes just focuses on these people, and it's quite effective. But things change towards the end of the Diaz regime, and dissidence doesn't just come from the known set of people. Dissidence starts to come from other people, and I think that's what can easily happen to Sheinbaum. I've created this thing, this apparatus that is going to do this very clear thing against these very clear baddies. Well, what happens if we have new baddies with new ideas and new strategies? Are you going to be ready for them? I don't think so.
There's an interesting case study here within the Porfirian regime example that we're using, which is these opaque intelligence structures created to make countries safer and in an effective way, and so you can't have too much oversight because that gets in the way. I think there's an issue here because they almost always turn in on themselves. And that's what we see with Porfirio Díaz. The baddies start living within the intelligence structure because they're so opaque. We saw this during the Porfirian regime because Porfirio Díaz was right at the top, but underneath him, it was Darwinian chaos. It was governors and military commanders and just different powerful business people and political figures who wanted to vie for power and be the second in command, second closest to Diaz. It's no accident that Bernardo Reyes, the military governor of Nuevo León and the northeast of Mexico, was also the spy master and also the second in command, the sort of seen as the man who would succeed Diaz once he was gone. It was because he was so immensely powerful. And it went way beyond Mexico. It went deep into the United States. This is crucial because throughout Mexican and American history, this border between the two countries has historically been incredibly permeable. That's literally the obsession of the Trump administration right now, how permeable that border is or isn't. And that was the case back then. Political rivals and criminals would tend to cross into the United States to avoid Mexican justice. And so you did need to have a network of powerful spies across the United States to keep tabs on these adversaries. And so you've got people like Enrique Krill, another governor, who had contacts in Washington, and he hired private detective agencies from the United States. You've got Bernardo Reyes, who had people, paid informants that included the chief of police in Laredo, Texas, basically fed information back to the Mexican government as a US political figure. And it was incredibly successful. I think people tend to think, it eventually collapsed, so that's why you shouldn't build these things. But actually, it was so effective for a long time. You had an uprising in 1891 based in Texas, run by a man called Catarino Egarza, whose remains in Panama were sought after by López Obrador because he was seen as a precedent to the Mexican Revolution. So that's how important this guy is. But he fails miserably. He's keeping an eye on all these other would-be uprisings. You've got the Magonistas, who are the sort of anarcho-syndicalists of the time, based a lot in LA. They had their US operations working alongside the US government to keep tabs on them, to shut them down if they ever got a bit too violent, to trace, for example, the rise of potential anti-American strikes, because there's no better way of getting the American government on your side than to say that something's going to be anti-American. This has been the strategy used by the Homeland Security Department, looking at anti-American protests here in Mexico City recently and saying, well, there you are, right? So you've justified our whole point. All these people should stay in their own countries, basically. Even the Mexicans think so. And so, but it wasn't just the Mexican government manipulating the US government. It was in their interest, too, to keep Mexico stable. They liked the Porfirio Díaz regime. He was pro-business. He kept things under check. What was worrying, though, of course, is as people tried to vie for power within the Porfirian regime, you started to get spy masters like Reyes spying on other elites and harassing them and looking after them, quote unquote, to keep them in check politically. This is why you start getting the harassment of names that Mexicans definitely know, of families like the Carranzas and the Maderos of Coahuila, people who were very powerful locally, but just below people like Reyes who felt threatened by them.
And I think something really important here, because we're in an age in which, for example, the US is happy to be building a government of the rich. We're all on the same side. It's fine. The rich and powerful can all be friends. Well, yes, until the rich disagree with the powerful or vice versa, right? The case of the Maderos is really interesting because the Maderos were historically allies of the government. These are some of the richest people in the planet at the time. And they'd become, yes, they were rich before Porfirio Díaz, but they become much richer thanks to Porfirio Díaz. And these people could not have been wealthier. So the first head of state to ever fly in a private airplane was a Mexican head of state, Francisco I. Madero. And that's not because he used a Mexican plane, a Mexican government plane. They didn't have one. He used his own private plane. So this is how very rich they were. Not even the president of the United States had their own plane, and Francisco Madero did. And despite being so rich and powerful and clear allies of the regime, those members of the members of that same regime start spying on these people. Spoiler, it doesn't end well for anyone.
Exactly right. Because when people start realizing they're being spied on, they get a bit uncomfortable and a bit antsy and start creating their own espionage agencies. One of the things that I think is interesting is to see the dominoes fall. First, you've got the lower level echelons being spied on and being the subject of suspicion from that sort of top, from people further up in the ranks. For example, the governor of Coahuila, who was underneath Reyes, is removed by Díaz, and he goes from being a spy for Reyes to a victim of espionage. But the same thing happens to Reyes eventually. Eventually people say, well, this Reyes really is number two. I wonder when he'll replace Porfirio Díaz. And Porfirio Díaz does not love that. And so in 1909, a year before the Mexican Revolution, Díaz probably does the most important thing that people don't talk about enough that undermines his presidency. He basically exiles Reyes, because he doesn't want him in the way. He's lost favor. And with Reyes gone, Díaz actually loses the most powerful ally that he probably didn't even know he had, which was this enormous espionage network centered around Reyes. Or rather, he probably did know he had it. He was just maybe worried he was being looked after by these security apparatuses himself. But Reyes gets kicked out. The whole system disappears. And suddenly, Díaz has a massive flank exposed in his northern border. The border with the United States, but also the borderlands along Coahuila, Tamaulipas, and Nuevo León. These are the places where the Mexican revolutionaries that declare war on the government in November 20th, 1910, that's where they come from. They're the elites who were previously spied on, who no longer worry as much about being spied on because the great spy master Reyes is gone, and from their respective exiles in Texas, start planning a revolution. The disappearance of the Reyes espionage apparatus is an enormous blow to Diaz, and that's probably why he collapses. But it's not necessarily the whole thing. It's because the revolutionaries, mostly Francisco y Madero, the guy who rode in the plane, the heir to the Madero fortune, this guy starts building his own intelligence apparatus. And he starts running circles around the people that Diaz still has in his service. And who are these people? At this point, once he's got rid of Reyes, they're actually mostly American detective agencies, which I think is crazy, because it's this weird mix of like film noir and Mexican bandito movies and a Western all mixed up together. The big protagonist here is the Furlong Secret Service Company, which tails Madero and sends a report on December 29th, 1910, which is about a month after the revolution is declared, from Texas. We call it the Plan de San Luis, but it actually should be called the Plan de San Antonio because it was printed along the banks of the river going through San Antonio today. But Madero is said by the Furlong reports to no longer be in San Antonio, but not yet in Mexico. But they've lost track. So they know they've got their secret agents posted, but they're not good enough anymore to have a constant tail on Madero. Whereas Madero, all this money really comes in handy, and all this knowledge of how the Porfirian intel apparatus worked, because he was a victim who now learnt from his victimhood, right? And with his money, his riches, he creates his own revolutionary espionage apparatus. He hires the Thiel Detective Company of El Paso. So this is basically the Mexican Revolution might actually be told as the story of competing private detective agencies from the United States. And these people working for the Thiel Detective Company work with Madero to build up his first intelligence operation, running circles around agents in the US and Mexico, and allowing him to smuggle weapons, get money, and cross the border to start this enormous process called the Mexican Revolution after the titanic failure of the Porfirian espionage apparatus. And it all happened because it turned in on itself, right? And that's ultimately something that brings us back to what worries me about these laws that we're seeing today with Claudia Sheinbaum. I tell all my friends in the government, I'm not so much worried maybe about you guys because you're all impeccable and have no issues at all. I'm worried about the next people to come into power, people with far fewer scruples than you, who will use this very apparatus against you once they get hold of it. And this is a great example of how you don't even have to leave power. You can stay in power as long as you want. But internal divisions, the politicking eventually erodes and corrupts what is an ultimately completely opaque system that gives you an enormous amount of power.
It must be said there are clear differences between what Claudia Sheinbaum's government is building and what Porfirio Díaz used in his 30 years, right? First of all, Sheinbaum is working through the laws. There are reforms. Porfirio Díaz never carried out reforms. He just created a secret police and used it in horrible ways. But what is also true is when we see the failure of that secret police and, Porfirio Díaz's regime falls in less than a year after 30 years of being in power, one of the main reasons that's given for this is that the police system and the police state was heavily decentralized. It worked so long as there wasn't a mass uprising. But the moment that uprising reached a certain critical mass, things were too decentralized to be able to actually do something. What Sheinbaum is creating is very centralized, which means it can be a lot more effective. Now, this can go one of two ways. One is that it works really well. The government takes on this massive project and they use it really well, and they're capable enough of developing the technological abilities to run this and then turn that into policy and action. That's great. But what happens when you have, a few years later, as you're saying, Alex, a level of political discord within the party, a sort of Bernardo Reyes situation that gets, exiled out into somewhere, and that leaves the government's flank exposed, and then someone in the government or outside the government starts using this very effective machinery against the government. Well, that's one problem, right? The other problem, and what actually worries me more, is what happens if the government throws a lot of money at building this massive database and then is thoroughly incompetent at running it, right? Mexico doesn't really have a vast talent pool of people who can create and run this kind of thing. It is a problem more broadly for startups. Like, there aren't the people. There's a shortage of such people in the world, let alone in Mexico. So they might create the data, which can then very easily be used incorrectly by other people who you don't want to have this data.
It almost feels like we live in a weird simulation, because I can't believe that the espionage company that is bought by Madero is an American company run by a guy called Thiel. Like, it's insane how close it is to what's happening now, which is the reform says simply, we will use AI and tech to run this database. And we've seen through terrible experiences with tech oligarchs like Peter Thiel today, who get an unprecedented access to government data through the fact that they have the tools to interpret it. Mexico does not have the capacity to run all the data it's going to get through AI. So that teeny tiny little line that says, we will use AI for intelligence purposes in this database, sends shivers down my spine, because I really don't think the government understands what that sentence means.
Absolutely. And I think even if they did, I don't think we are capable of understanding as a society sort of the implications of what the implications of this could be. Because maybe the government says, oh, like, we need to make sure that this doesn't, just fall into private hands, and we need to control that very well. But we are still experimenting with AI. We don't even know which direction this can take. So now you have tons of data about 130 million private citizens, and you don't really know what you're doing with it. You can try really hard, but you don't know the full implications just yet. So it really is, or really has the potential to be, a Pandora's box.
So we stand on this weird tightrope. On one side, we've got experience from history, which we've just gone through, and all the terrible lessons we clearly haven't learned as a society. And then on the other side is the cliff of the unknown, which is there is a lot of new stuff going on that is getting pushed through this legislation, and we literally have no precedent for it. I don't know which side I'm more worried about, but I'm definitely keen to keep having a look at what goes on with it with you, Tavo.
And until next time, I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Homrod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast. If you like what you've heard today, make sure to give us a like and share with your friends and loved ones.
Especially if you give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a comment, because that really helps with the algorithm, which we're all beholden to, it turns out. But definitely, overall, subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist, because that's where you're going to get not only this podcast, but also all the content we're always talking about, including an analysis of these intelligence reforms in far more depth, an analysis of the National Guard, and everything in between. See you next time.
And don't forget to put your phone in airplane mode.